Japan has more centenarians per capita than any country on Earth. It has some of the lowest rates of depression in the developed world. And by most measures, it's one of the most quietly disciplined cultures we have records of. Ask most people why, and you'll hear the usual answers. Diet, green tea, fish, good genetics, something in the water. But researchers who've actually spent their careers studying Japanese psychology, sociology, and neuroscience will tell you that's not really the answer, or at least it's not the main answer. The diet matters, yes, but what matters more is the layer underneath the diet, the way the culture thinks about time, purpose, imperfection, rest, and attention, a handful of small daily habits that most of us in the West have never even been told about, and that neuroscience is only starting to explain properly. And here's the thing, these aren't ancient practices that take a lifetime to learn. They're not complicated, they're not even dramatic. There are 8 quiet shifts in how you relate to ordinary moments. Once you understand what each one is doing at the neurological level, it gets very hard to look at your own day the same way again. 1. Ikigai, your reason to get up. Ikigai roughly translates as reason for being. It sits at the intersection of 4 questions: what you love, what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you can be paid for. Most explanations of Ikigai present it as a destination you're supposed to find. It isn't. It's a direction, a daily orientation toward meaning rather than away from discomfort. You don't need all 4 boxes ticked to have one. You need to know which way you're facing. A long-running study from the Japanese government's Institute of Population and Social Security followed thousands of participants over 7 years and found that people with a strong sense of Ikigai were 19% less likely to die from cardiovascular disease. This wasn't people who exercised more, or ate better, or slept more. It was people who felt their lives had purpose. The protection came from the meaning itself. Psychologists have a word for this: eudaimonic well-being. Aristotle was the first to name it, and decades of modern research have backed him up. It's a different thing from hedonic well-being, which is the pleasure-based happiness most of Western culture is optimizing for. Hedonic happiness is about feeling good. Eudaimonic happiness is about living in a way that aligns with what matters to you. The brain responds to each of them very differently. When you have a clear sense of purpose, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that handles planning, decision-making, and impulse control, stays more consistently active. Your baseline cortisol drops. Your immune function improves. A 2016 study in Psychological Science even found that people with a stronger sense of purpose slept better. Deeper, more restorative sleep, which then quietly improves almost every other cognitive metric you'd care to measure. The absence of Ikigai isn't neutral. Purposelessness shows up in the research linked to faster cognitive decline, higher depression rates, and what Japanese researchers describe as kodawari, a kind of aimless attachment to distraction as a substitute for meaning. The habit. Each morning before you reach for your phone, ask yourself one question: what am I doing today that actually matters to someone, including me? The answer doesn't have to be profound. It just has to be honest. A small, real answer every morning does more for the purpose circuitry in your brain than any weekend retreat ever will. 2. Kaizen, the power of 1% better. Kaizen means continuous improvement. The important word isn't improvement, it's continuous. The whole philosophy rests on a single idea, which is that big, dramatic change is neurologically unsustainable, and your brain is built to resist it. Here's what's going on underneath. Your amygdala evolved to treat sudden, large changes as threats. So when you announce to yourself on a Sunday evening that starting Monday you are going to completely overhaul your diet, your sleep, your fitness, your finances, and your relationships, your amygdala reads that as danger. It doesn't care that the changes are good for you. It only cares that they're big and fast. So it starts quietly undermining them. Procrastination, rationalization, the slow draining of motivation that most people later mistake for laziness or lack of willpower. Kaizen sidesteps all of this. The improvements are so small they never trip the alarm. They feel almost pointless, which is exactly why they work. A 2021 study in the British Journal of Psychology found that people pursuing roughly 1% daily improvements had dramatically higher completion rates, far lower dropout rates, and much higher odds of still being doing the habit 6 months later than people chasing big transformational goals. The math is almost absurd. 1% better every day for a year compounds to roughly 37 times better. Not 37% better. 37 times. Most people never get near that number because they're trying to get there in one leap, and the brain simply won't sustain the effort. The tortoise isn't just winning the race. The tortoise also isn't burning out at the halfway mark and spending the next 6 months recovering on the couch. What makes Kaizen so interesting psychologically is what it does to your identity over time. Small, consistent actions create evidence. Evidence creates belief. Belief turns into identity. Someone who walks for 5 minutes every morning doesn't just get slightly fitter. They gradually become a person who exercises. That identity shift ends up being worth far more than any single dramatic New Year's resolution. The habit: pick one thing today and make it 1% better. One less minute of scrolling, one more glass of water. A single paragraph written. One kind word you might otherwise have swallowed. Small. Sustainable. Every day, stop trying to feel inspired. Try to be consistent instead. 3. Wabi-Sabi. Beauty in imperfection. Wabi-Sabi is the Japanese art of finding beauty in things that are imperfect, incomplete, or impermanent. A cracked tea bowl repaired with gold. A garden that looks different every season. A face that shows the years it has lived. The underlying idea is that nothing, perfect, permanent, or finished, is as beautiful as something that carries the honest marks of time and use. In Western culture, imperfection tends to be treated as a problem to be solved. In Japan, it's treated as a truth to be accepted, and over time, appreciated. The psychological consequences of those two positions turn out to be huge. Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett at the University of British Columbia have spent years studying what they call socially prescribed perfectionism. It's the compulsive attempt to meet a standard that isn't even your own, but one you believe other people hold for you. Of all the varieties of perfectionism, this is the one most strongly linked to chronic anxiety, clinical depression, procrastination, and what researchers call self-silencing, which is essentially the slow retreat from challenge because the possibility of imperfect performance feels worse than the loss of the experience itself. Wabi-Sabi is the antidote. When you practice seeing beauty in external imperfection, in objects, in nature, in other people, you gradually rewire the lens you use to see yourself. Self-compassion, which grows almost automatically out of a Wabi-Sabi orientation, has been shown in Kristen Neff's work at the University of Texas to lower cortisol, improve cognitive flexibility, increase motivation after failure, and produce better long-term performance than self-criticism in almost every domain studied. The cracked teacup isn't the problem. The belief that only uncracked things have value is, and that belief has a real cost that most people are paying without ever quite noticing. The habit: once a day, find something imperfect. A scuffed chair, an uneven hedge, a half-finished project, and look at it with appreciation instead of judgment. Start with objects, then practice it on your own work, and then, when you're ready, practice it on yourself. 4. Hara Hachibu. Stop before you're full. Hara Hachibu comes from Okinawa, one of the world's original blue zones, where it isn't unusual for people to live well past 100 with their minds and bodies still intact. The phrase translates roughly as, eat until you are 80% full. It's traditionally spoken before a meal, a small deliberate pause inserted into what would otherwise be an automatic behavior. Research in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has repeatedly shown that caloric restriction in this range extends longevity markers across species, including ours. But the more interesting finding is what the practice does to the brain over time. Chronic overconsumption of food, yes, but also of information, stimulation, activity, and social input keeps the nervous system in a constant low hum of activation. The system is always processing and never really recovering. Hara Hachibu teaches the brain something surprisingly difficult in the modern world: how to be okay with not being completely satisfied, how to stop before completion, how to sit with enough instead of reaching reflexively for more. That makes it more than a diet rule. It's a training ground for restraint. And restraint is the same mental muscle that lets you close the laptop at a reasonable hour, or leave a conversation before it becomes an argument, or skip the next episode when your body is already asking for sleep. Cultures that have built restraint into small daily rituals don't need to summon willpower out of nowhere. They've already grown the capacity for it into ordinary acts, the habit. At your next meal, stop when you feel satisfied rather than full. Sit with the slight discomfort of having had just about enough. Notice how quickly it passes. Then try applying the same 80% rule somewhere else in your week. 5. Shinrin-Yoku, forest bathing. Shinrin-Yoku translates as forest bathing. It isn't hiking, it isn't bird watching, it isn't exercising with a nice view. It's being inside a natural environment slowly and without an agenda, letting the forest exist around you while you exist inside it. This is probably the most studied habit on the list, at least in the West. The original Japanese government-funded research from the 1980s and 90s found that 20 minutes in a forest environment produced measurable drops in cortisol and blood pressure, increases in natural killer cell activity, the immune system's first line of defense against disease, and reduced activity in the rumination circuits of the prefrontal cortex. Put simply, the brain stops rehearsing its problems. The psychologist Rachel Kaplan's attention restoration theory explains the mechanism well. We have two kinds of attention. Directed attention is the focused, effortful kind, and it's finite. Every hour you spend in artificial environments, open-plan offices, city streets, screens, draws down that reserve. By evening, most people are running on fumes and can't quite say why. The other kind, involuntary attention, is effortless, and it's the one that actually restores you. Natural environments trigger it automatically. You don't have to try to pay attention to a forest. Your brain just opens. 20 minutes is enough to measurably refill your directed attention tank. 30 starts producing immune effects. 3 times a week seems to be the threshold for longer-term changes in how the stress system behaves. The habit: 20 minutes outside, without your phone. No podcast fills the silence. No destination pulling you forward. Just the environment. Let your eyes rest on things that aren't asking anything of you. 6. Inamuri, the art of strategic rest. In Japan, falling asleep in public, on a train, at your desk, in a meeting, carries almost no social stigma. It's called inamuri, and it's quietly respected. The assumption is that someone dozing off is a person who's been working hard enough to need rest wherever they can get it. The culture doesn't punish exhaustion. It accommodates it without making a fuss. That's a sharp contrast to Western productivity culture, which tends to treat the need for rest as a kind of personal failure, something to be overcome with discipline, caffeine, and a better morning routine. The result is a population that is chronically underslept, dependent on stimulants just to function, and genuinely confused about why their focus and mood keep sliding despite their best efforts. There's a NASA study that gets cited constantly on this, because it's one of the cleanest pieces of research we have. A 26-minute nap improved pilot performance by 34%, and alertness by 100%. Not a modest bump, a substantial one. The National Sleep Foundation's work on micro-rest shows that even 10 to 20 minutes of eyes-closed, body-still rest does more to restore working memory, emotional regulation, and executive function than the same amount of time spent on passive stimulation like social media. But the most important thing about inamuri isn't the nap. It's the permission, the cultural removal of shame from the act of resting. When rest is guilt-free, it restores you. When it comes packaged with self-criticism, I shouldn't be doing this, I'm being lazy, I'll make up for it later. The nervous system never fully drops out of alert mode, and the rest doesn't really land. Japan has built the permission into its culture. The rest of us, Mostly have to build it into ourselves. 7. Ma, the power of empty space. Ma is almost impossible to translate cleanly. It's usually described as negative space, the pause between musical notes that gives a melody its shape, the empty corner of a room that lets the furniture breathe, the silence in a conversation that gives the words their weight. But empty isn't quite right. In Japanese thought, ma isn't the absence of something. It's a thing in its own right, a purposeful, necessary emptiness. In neuroscience, this maps closely onto what's called the default mode network. First identified by the Harvard neuroscientist Marcus Reichel in 2001, it's a set of brain regions that only switches on when you're not doing anything in particular. For a long time, neuroscientists assumed this was the brain idling. Reichel's work showed it was doing something much more interesting. The default mode network is where creativity, self-reflection, emotional processing, empathy, and long-term planning actually get worked out. It's not the brain resting, it's the brain doing its deepest background work. And it only turns on when there's nothing demanding your attention from the outside. It requires me. The modern world has, without really meaning to, waged a war on this network. Every gap gets filled, the notification, the podcast, the scroll, the background music. We've made silence uncomfortable and stillness suspicious. And by deleting ma from our days, we've quietly deleted the conditions that most of our important mental processing needs in order to happen. The insight doesn't arrive during the meeting. It arrives in the shower. The decision doesn't resolve while you're analyzing it. It resolves on the walk home. That isn't a coincidence. That's the default mode network being briefly allowed to do its job. The habit. Carve out one deliberate pocket of ma in your day. The commute without headphones. 8. Shokunin, the spirit of mastery. Shokunin describes a craftsman's spirit, total devotion to the perfection of a single practice over a lifetime. The sushi chef who spends 10 years learning to prepare rice before being allowed near the fish. The calligrapher who fills thousands of sheets of paper with a single character before considering themselves competent. The woodworker who spends years studying the grain of timber before ever making the first cut. Not because society demands that level of devotion, because the work deserves it. The shokunin simply believes that if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing with everything you have. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called flow, the state of total absorption in a challenging task where self-consciousness disappears, time warps, and performance settles into its natural peak. His research, drawn from athletes, surgeons, musicians, artists, and craftspeople across dozens of cultures, found that flow states share a consistent neurological pattern. The prefrontal cortex quiets. The default mode network powers down. The brain slips into a state that feels, oddly, both effortless and more alive than usual. Flow requires two conditions. Skill and challenge have to be balanced, and the person has to be genuinely invested in the process, not the outcome. That's where shokunin becomes a psychological tool. When you're locked onto the outcome, the finished product, the external validation, the reward at the end, your brain is in anticipatory tension. Cortisol up. The reward system is hungry. Attention ping-ponging between now and later. When you're locked onto the craft instead, the quality of this cut, this brushstroke, this sentence, the nervous system settles into parasympathetic engagement. Calm, absorbed, shokunin reframes work as a practice, not a production. And that small reframe, applied consistently, gives you something most productivity systems never reach: a sustainable relationship with effort. One that doesn't rely on motivation, because it has outgrown the need for it. The habit. Pick one thing you already do regularly and give it your full attention for a week. Not to perform better, not to get a result, just to give it everything you have for its own sake. Pay attention to what changes, not only in the work, but in how you feel while you're doing it. These 8 habits aren't a system. They don't require a planner, a morning routine, or an accountability partner. They're a culture's accumulated answer to a question the modern world keeps asking, and never quite answering: how do you actually live well inside an ordinary life? You don't need all 8. you probably only need the one that felt familiar while you were reading it. The one that didn't land as a new idea so much as something you already knew and had forgotten. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you liked the video. Anyway, I wish you a nice and sunny day.